Well, in democracy, it's practically the foundation. Without it, democracy breaks down. Debate is restricted, and ultimately, our nation wouldn't look the same. Now, I'm going to be explaining what is freedom of speech, because it's an elusive term which gets thrown around quite a lot. Okay, so according to the dictionary definition, it's the right to express one's opinions freely. Now, when I hear that, I think, first of all, it's a right, second of all, freely. Now, what does freely mean? So, I suppose the connotations of freely would be without restraint. So, you're not holding yourself back, nobody else is holding you back. But in my mind, that's a bit bizarre. I don't understand how anyone can have freedom of speech, because we are not free from our consequences, for consequences of the words we say, and I mean, most people filter what comes out of their mouth, so that's a form of self-censorship. And I mean, certainly in my life, it's there's examples all around us of where we've been censored in some way. At school, we're not allowed to use swear words or inappropriate language, and when I was at secondary school, I used a certain word in a French lesson, which at the time I didn't think there was anything bad about it, but I got a very stern warning. She was not happy, but I was shocked when I was that age, and I was like, what's wrong with it? Because I heard my music teacher using it, well, certainly not infrequently. So one teacher telling me off for using the word, the other one using it himself. So the trouble with freedom of speech is it's quite subjective where the limits are. Now, so that's an example of social censorship, and also it's unbelievable. I mean, there's really no hope left, because I was preparing my talk, and I wanted to include my mother and some childhood stories as an example. So I asked her for permission, as the good son I am, and she said, yeah, I'll read it first, then I'll censor it. And it's absolutely bizarre. I promise you, I did not put her up to that. She used the word censor. So the irony of me doing a freedom of speech talk and my own mum censoring it, outrageous. But there's an important distinction between censorship through law and censorship socially, and through different organisations. For example, on this stage, I'm meant to stay on this stage. This is the TEDx's, I think it's a rule at least, and I'm not allowed to step off. But legally, there's nothing to stop me from doing so, because I'm here, I've been invited, I'm not trespassing, so I can just step off, and that's okay. Whereas, I don't know the consequences of what will happen by the organisation, but we'll find out. And so, yeah, freedom of speech is ultimately, I'm going to be focusing on the legal side, because it's easier to define. You can look at the law, say, that's the law, this is the implications of it, this is what will happen if you break it. Now, there's historical examples of where we've got freedom of speech. There's the Human Rights Act, and in that for the UK, we have freedom of speech, we've got freedom of expression. In America, they've got the First Amendment. Now, in America, you've got, there was the Red Scare, it's sometimes referred to, or McCarthyism, named after a senator, and the idea is that in the 1950s, there was widespread fear of communist spies, and that didn't just stay with politicians, that didn't just affect those higher up, that affected ordinary people. So for job interviews, for instance, well, you know what the job interview is like. You go there, you say, they ask you questions, maybe a bit about you, a bit of chat to just get it going, and then it's about your qualifications and experience. But in that, they also included your political leanings. And if you were deemed to be too close to communism, then you wouldn't get jobs. So people's livelihoods were ruined. And another, well, that's just an example of where freedom of speech is stopped, so where our speech has bad consequences. But what about when our speech isn't allowed out at all? So in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, there was a lot of censorship. So I'm sure many people in this room here are creators. Some do art, some do carving, some will make music. But in that time, it was censored depending on your political stance. If it didn't support the Soviet goals, then it was not allowed out. And George Orwell, who I'm sure many people will have heard of, he's quite a famous author, and he's written many books of fiction, one of which being 1984, which refers to thought crimes. Now, he based the ruling class of this off the ruling class in the Soviet Union. Now, thought control, I mean, I've got no idea what this man in the front row is thinking right now. I certainly can't control it. And I'm sure many of you may be thinking, it's an interesting book, but what's the relevance? What does our thoughts... It's a dystopia. It's looking into the future and saying, this is bad, we can't reach here. And it's dramatising it, essentially. Well, unfortunately, our thoughts can be controlled, as it turns out, in the United Kingdom. So, we have this woman here who was arrested for praying. Nothing else, praying. And in college, we get taught all these different principles that the UK has, like rule of law, religious freedom, freedom of speech. But it seems that there are, despite getting drilled into us over and over again, it's not necessarily true, because there's new laws which come into place which counteract that. So this woman was arrested for praying outside an abortion centre in Birmingham, and this was due to the Public Spaces Protection Order, which, for the Birmingham one, specifically said you're not allowed to pray. The idea is you're not allowed to demonstrate, so you can't inform others. I can't say, do you know the statistics of how many women had an abortion this year, without people's express permission. So, and this is a 150-metre area outside an abortion centre from any point. So it could be in shops, it could be in the streets, and she was standing outside of that. Her right to protest had been taken away. Now, so she's not handing out leaflets, she's not obstructing anyone, she's not going up to anyone. She was arrested purely for standing outside, praying silently. Where's the logic? And so the reason I'm telling you all this is not so that you may agree with her views or anything of the sort, because but what I'm trying to say is that freedom of speech should be protected, or else it can go further and further when you restrict it. For example, these buffer zone laws, these are in place in local councils across England and Scotland, but they are not nationwide. It's the council's process to instil them. But there is a demonstrations bill going through Parliament which is making them nationwide. So but that's if it gets, of course, passed. And this is an example of where the freedom to think is infringed upon. But what actually happens when we think? Where does the content come from? Where does the ideas come from? I mean, sure, education, even our encounters with in daily life. We build up a list of experiences, but I'm sure many people here, when they're, well, I reckon most people here use some form of social media, and I'm pretty sure that's a fair bet. So our ideas come from things around us, like the internet, which, in my opinion, is a good thing. It should be just sharing of information. And recently, over Twitter, we've had a lot of over COVID, we've had a lot of information coming in from a variety of sources. Now, it was revealed by Elon Musk and an independent journalist who took on Twitter. Then it was confirmed in a court case in America this year that Twitter has censored certain doctors, or so either removed their videos completely, or they took away the right for it to be shown to a large audience. So it was called like blacklisting, essentially. So it was a trends blacklist for some people, for some doctors, and where they could only reach a certain amount of people with their views. It was mostly saying that views such as questioning lockdown, or saying that it is not right for people indiscriminately to get the vaccine, which you either agree or you don't. Doesn't really, not really a concern, but the idea that we should have freedom of information is very important, and without it being controlled or limited in some way. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule. I mean, there's certain things I'm sure you don't want people seeing on the internet and your kids seeing, but I think when it comes to information shared by credible sources like doctors, it should not be controlled. And so the point is, where do we stop? When we bring in these laws like the buffer zones, which some would say would be good, but how sensitive does a topic have to be before you put a buffer zone around it? And can't that spread more and more? So that's the idea that I'm going to be leaving here with you today. What can you do to make sure, to notice that these laws aren't being put in place, and just be aware of what the impacts are on society? Right. Well, thank you very much.